Okay, can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello, I'm here.
Yeah, okay, Mr. Leonardo, we are going to start now.
Very good.
Presentation, please. Hello, everyone. This is our 5th live webinar. And today we have a great speaker. But welcome everybody to our 4th live webinar. Sorry, this is the 4th. And first, we are going to know today our YouTube channel is English Teachers in Peru. Queremos invitarlos a todos, estimados colegas, el día de hoy, a que se puedan suscribir a nuestro canal en YouTube. Una vez que ustedes ingresen a YouTube, ingresan la dirección del canal, que es www.youtube.com/English Teachers in Peru. Una vez que ingresan, pueden darle clic a suscribirse y finalmente van a tener todas las notificaciones y van a poder visualizar todos los videos que tenemos en nuestro canal. Vamos a incluir todos los webinars y esto a pedido de muchos de ustedes, también los webinars pasados para que puedan quedar grabados y los puedan visualizar y así todos nos podamos llenar de aprendizaje. Bien. Now we are going to share with you some directions. Please, you have to consider them. Please type your questions in the comment section together with your name and place of living. Don't forget it, please. Next, another direction is the answers to your questions and comments will be replied by our guest speaker at the end of the webinar in the question time session. When finishing the webinar, we will share a link for you to have access to the exit ticket, which will be available for 45 minutes. Okay, please consider those directions. Now, it's time to know our guest speaker today. Please, Ms. Nefti, hi.
Hi. Hello everyone and welcome to the 4th webinar session in English Teachers in Peru Community Live. My name is Nefti and I am super excited to have you here today. I can see there's a lot of people joining us today, not only from Peru but from all over the world. I'll be with you today along with my other colleagues behind the scenes who will be serving as moderators to help answer your questions and respond to your comments during this webinar. It's a pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to introduce our amazing guest speaker, Mr. Leo Mercado. And believe me, when I say amazing, I mean it. Mr. Leo Mercado has a unique career path and professional history in terms of language teaching, not only in Peru, but also abroad. He has been working in the field of teaching as a teacher, teacher trainer, academic director, academic consultant, and international plenary speaker for more than 25 years. Mr. Mercado has been the elected president of IATFL, where he had the responsibility of organizing great events for teachers' development in Peru, as well as coordinating the different operations carried on with the authorities of IATFL in United Kingdom. He has also developed some national projects together with the Department of Education in Peru, as well as some virtual platforms in English. On the other hand, Mr. Mercado has also been involved in research, being the author of some publications in the US and in United Kingdom as well. He has been an active member of some prestigious international committees and a certified expert in international examination by the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Language, Cambridge University, and University of Michigan. He was also the founder of New York City Learning Solutions, where he currently works as the executive director. In today's webinar, Mr. Mercado is going to offer us a presentation titled Myth or Fact, looking at the research and classroom practice. In this presentation, we will focus on common perception teachers have about the teaching and learning process. By referring to the research and try and tested principle, we will uphold good teaching practices, as well as dispel the myths that can hinder students' potential for learning. The speaker will discuss key issues from both a conceptual and practical perspective. So, without further delay, Mr. Mercado, the audience is all yours.
Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here with you tonight. So let me share my screen. I believe my screen, let's take a look here. I had my presentation ready to go. So let's take a look and see if I am the one sharing my screen right now. Okay, can everybody see that? That is the cover page for my presentation, Myth or Fact, looking at the research and classroom practice. So yes, indeed, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at a variety of common perceptions about the teaching and learning process. We're going to analyze them. We're going to look at them because they are often stated, and we see them as we work in the classroom, whether it be face-to-face or virtual, whether we be teachers or coordinators. These are things that we often see in class. So what we're going to try to do is go a little deeper and determine the extent to which they are based on solid principles, research, how we can make informed decisions based on the different aspects of the teaching and learning process that we will be analyzing. So let's begin. Let's take a look. We're going to start off with the belief or the perception, and then I'm going to give you some extra information. Now you have to be a little careful because the information I will give you may or may not lead you to the right answer, whether it be a myth or a fact. So I'm going to try to give you some information to kind of help you make or arrive at your own conclusion. And then what we'll do is we'll determine to what extent it is indeed a myth or a fact, and we'll try to link it or associate it with classroom practice, which is in the end ultimately the goal that we have here today. Okay, so let's begin with the first one. And this is a little controversial because especially now that we find ourselves in a new reality. Now, the belief is that face-to-face instruction in a physical classroom within the confines of four walls in an educational institution is inherently superior to virtual learning. Okay, so that is the statement. Okay, so that is something that we are putting to the test today because we find ourselves, again, as I said before, in a new reality. Well, you know, we were kind of thrust forward into unfamiliar territory, you know, because of the crisis, the unfortunate crisis that we're all facing. So we had to leave behind our comfort zone, and we had to leave behind our classrooms that we were so accustomed to for the duration of our careers, and now we find ourselves working day by day or day after day in virtual learning environments. So that is the statement. Is it a myth or is it a fact? Is it indeed true that face-to-face instruction, that working in a physical classroom with students seated at their desks is better than working on a virtual platform like Zoom or Blackboard or Click Meeting? Now that's the first statement we're going to explore today. Okay, let's take a look. And in order to kind of arrive at the right answer, well, we'll do a little quiz first. Okay, I have four statements for you, and I'd like you to determine if you think the statement is true or if the statement is false. And what I'm going to
Mr. Mercado,
yes,
we cannot see your screen now.
I believe I am sharing my screen. Am I not? Can you see my screen?
We see you.
Can you see my screen now?
I know your slides
No,
now.
You can see my, oh, I see. Okay. So you're telling me you can't see my slides.
Yes,
Interesting.
very important.
Interesting. That's okay. We'll take care of that right away. Let's see what might be causing the slight disruption here. Again, technology is not perfect, so let's take a look. And okay, and okay, let's take a look. That's Nellie's. We're going to go to mine. Can you see the screen now? Hello?
Here you
Can,
go. Perfectly
Hey,
well now.
okay, perfect. All right, we're back in business. Okay, that was fast. All right, very good. So the first one, as I said before, is the belief or the statement. We don't know to what extent, it is true or false that face-to-face instruction is superior to virtual learning. Okay, so a couple of questions that I'd like you to look at right now. Number one, students interact more in a face-to-face class. Okay, so that is a statement. The first statement I'd like you to think about, do you think that's true? Or do you think it's false? The second one, students have a better chance of using technology in a face-to-face class. Again, is that true or false? The third statement, students cover more activities and tasks in a textbook. Now remember, we've been so accustomed to, especially Latin America. Latin America is a very course book or textbook oriented culture. It has one. So is that true? And finally, students feel more comfortable in a face-to-face class. These are the four statements I'd like you to think about. I'll give you about, let's see, I'll give you about a minute and a half, about 90 seconds. Now, I'm sure that I'm dealing with an experienced audience, so I'm pretty sure that you can arrive at your own conclusions about each of these statements, and then we'll go over them together. Okay, so again, 90 seconds, and try to come to a conclusion as to whether each statement is true or false, based on what you've experienced and what you've done. And if you like, you can start typing your own answers in the chat box if that is available to you. And then we'll have a more or less a good idea of where the audience is on each of these points. So you can write the number and T or F for true or false. We have about 30 seconds. Now we have 15 seconds. Okay. So let's see. Let's look at the first one. Now, students interact more in a face-to-face class. This is a very important statement because interaction is fundamental to the success of our lessons. We have to have our students interact with each other. We have to get them to maximize their ability to use the language in class. And that will take place either in a face-to-face environment or in a virtual environment. It has to take place in both. So the question is, do we see more interaction in a physical classroom? The answer to that, the first impression would be perhaps yes. But the fact of the matter is, there is not necessarily any particular difference or distinctive difference between the face-to-face class and the virtual class when it comes to interaction. In fact, it really depends on how the teacher leads the class or the lesson, all right? What is true is we have to maximize interaction between the students and between the students and the teacher and yourself as you are getting them to speak as much as possible. That's what we call maximizing student talk time. But you can do just as much or promote just as much interaction in a virtual class. And in some cases, you might be able to do a little more interaction in a virtual class than you might in a face-to-face class, especially if you're teaching a virtual environment under optimal conditions. And that means that we do not try to emulate what we've been doing for the longest time, which is a common mistake, trying to just simply copy and paste what we've been doing in a face-to-face class and applying it to a virtual classroom. Ideally, what we need is smaller groups to really make the virtual class work. And if you have smaller groups, not 25 or 30 or 35 students, then you can get a lot more interaction in a virtual environment, and it can be much faster. The second one, students have a better chance of using technology in a face-to-face class. You know, your first impression might be, well, yeah, sure. I mean, an institution like a school or language center or university, you know, if they make the proper investment, they're going to have loads of technology in the classroom. But if you really think about it, and again, you know, technological limitations notwithstanding, we do realize that there are a lot of limitations in different parts of the country when it comes to internet connection and the access to the devices that we require. But assuming that we have a class, each student with their own platform, with their own tablet or with their own computer, and sufficient internet access, you actually have more access to the students have a better chance of using technology because each student has their own interface. And if you're using a platform like Zoom, or if you're using a platform like Click Meeting or Blackboard Collaborate or what have you, all the students can participate at the same time. Okay, it's not they don't have to go up one at a time like we used to, like we do have, or we used to have in the physical classroom. So there is an advantage in that particular case, and you might have more students using technology than you might in a face-to-face class. Third, students cover more activities and tasks in a textbook. Well, the textbook, we know, we've been using textbooks for the longest time. Ever since I arrived in Peru and I started teaching English, the first thing they handed to me was a textbook. And, and they also gave me something called a suggested teaching schedule, which was something that the institute or the university wanted me to cover in a certain period of time. And so there were activities and tasks in the book that I had to cover each class, right? And so I had to make sure I kept up with the pace and I followed that schedule as closely as possible. But actually, the thing with virtual learning, if you have the right platform, you can actually cover more content, more time, and at your own leisure or your own convenience than you would in a face-to-face class. So as you can see, we're starting to dispel some common perceptions that we might have had about virtual learning. Everybody automatically assumed before this whole pandemic thing happened that, oh, virtual learning, yeah, that's like your third choice or the last resort if you had nothing else to do, if you weren't able to deliver teaching in class. And the last one, students feel more comfortable in a face-to-face classroom. I've heard people say, well, you know what, you can't create, what's really important when you're in a real classroom, quote unquote real, is that you create a sense of community. That we meet all the time, we meet every Tuesday and Thursday, or we meet every day for an hour and a half, and we create a sense of a feeling or of belonging, all right? And that you can't do that in a virtual class. Well, those of you who have been working, I think all of us have been working online for at least the last 4 or 5 months, if we haven't been doing it longer. Now you know that every time you meet with your students, hopefully they're happy to see you and you're happy to see them. And they know each other, they know you, they know what each person has to give to the lesson. And so we start building this sense of community that we were criticizing virtual learning for before, that we thought was impossible. So if you really think about it, it is possible to feel good. In fact, if you're studying from home, if you're participating in a class from home, you can have your cup of coffee right next to you. You can be in a very comfortable sofa. You can have everything within reach. Whereas in a classroom at a language center, it might be very different. You might be in a crowded class with 24 or 25 or 28 other students, not feeling so comfortable, very warm. If you want, you can turn on your air conditioning at your house. So again, it's relative, and we see it's not that clear cut. So it really depends. At the very least, at least as far as these 4 points are concerned, face-to-face instructions does not have an advantage over virtual learning. In fact, virtual learning has some key advantages that cannot be replicated in the physical classroom. Number one, the students, if again, they have access to the right platform, the students will be able to expose themselves to massive amounts of input in the language. okay, if they have the right platform. Now, if you don't have a right platform, if you just have an ebook, right, or you have what they call an e-workbook, which is something that they created way back when I was working at one of those language institutes that I worked for, and I asked the publisher to create an e-workbook. You don't have that much content, but if you have the right platform, the right LMS, you'll have massive, abundant amounts of input, and you'll be able to recycle different topics, different communicative functions, time and time again, as many times as you want. This is the advantage. So a lot of the things that we had to cover, or that we could not cover in class because we didn't have enough time as teachers, students can cover on their own if the LMS, if the platform is strong enough, if the platform is well designed, okay? So that is a major requisite, right? Or prerequisite, that the platform be strong or robust enough to provide the content that students need to enhance their learning. And the third advantage is focus. Again, in a physical classroom, the way things were back in February, up to February, we had to cover a course book. And in the course book, oftentimes, and apart from the activities that we would come up with our own, because, you know, I always believed in teacher creativity and encouraging my teachers to come up with their own content to complement or even replace the content in the course book. But in general terms, you had to follow a specific schedule, and you didn't have time to focus on some very important things. One thing, for example, would be reading fluency, or another would be pronunciation. Now, students, if they have the right platform at their disposal, they can focus on these things much longer and many more times than they could in the physical classroom. And the perfect example would be pronunciation, right? Because pronunciation, let me go back, pronunciation is something, let's be honest, we don't really cover as much as we should or we would like, because it's the Benjamin of all of the different language skills and forms, right? So it's actually a form. And so we want to cover pronunciation. And usually when you look at a typical course book, the pronunciation activity is very small and you go through it very quickly and then you move on, right? And teachers don't really feel that comfortable with pronunciation, especially when you have to mention phonetics, all right? And you have to deal with the articulators or the speech organs, and you have to highlight how they're pronounced, you know, demonstrating. Here, for example, this is a platform that we work with at NYC Learning Solutions. And this is an example of the input whereby the student can access, depending on the different topics, they can access input, they can listen to international English, they can see examples of English in text, in written form, and they can also listen to the language being used in a variety of different situations. And then what you can do is you can start delving into specific aspects of your language skills. Here, for example, you can see that the sounds are highlighted in terms of how they're made. And you can see an actual person pronouncing or making the sounds, articulating the sounds, right? With the mouth or with the tongue or with the teeth. And then what you see here is individual words or phrases that can be evaluated by the system. You can hear yourself and you can practice as long as you want. And whole sentences whereby you're dealing more with as opposed to the segmentals, you're dealing with the suprasegmentals, with the stress, rhythm, and intonation. The system will evaluate you on that, right? By the way, I got that 83 there because I purposely mispronounced Lisette, okay, as a name. So here, for example, yes, we had a fantastic vacation. Okay, so here I am pronouncing the, and it reads out what I spoke into the system. The system is talking to me and I am recording my voice and it will articulate what I'm saying, okay? We had breakfast on the beach every day. And so it records and then it writes out, it identifies what I said and I can match and I can practice this with the system. This is you can't hear her because I didn't have the audio in reverse. It didn't really capture her voice, but you can hear it when you're interacting with it. And this is something called the studio, where you have a collection
interesting area
of about 9,000 words and expressions divided into the different levels of the Common European Framework and language proficiency. Okay, so as you can see here, these are things that we wouldn't have time to cover in class. and they're very important. Pronunciation, I think, how many of you think pronunciation is important? Should we cover pronunciation when we're teaching English? And I can see that a lot of you think the answer is yes. And so, yes, pronunciation is fundamental to cover, but oftentimes, as I said before, we don't have the time, because if we are too stuck to a schedule given to us by the institution, we don't get to focus on things as much as we would like to that are very important. As we know, pronunciation contributes directly to intelligibility of what people say or comprehensibility. So it is something that we should cover. But the students can practice as long as they want, as many times as they want. And that's the great thing about working virtual, okay? So that's number one. So I think we can lay to rest this idea that face-to-face instruction or teaching is inherently superior to virtual learning. It really depends on how we do things. And another point I want to make before we move to number two is, when we do something for the first time and we're not really accustomed to it, we kind of miss what we used to do, right? What we were so comfortable with, which was teaching in the classroom. So we're doing the virtual thing. I was like, oh, this virtual thing, I'm not that crazy about it. We got to do it now because of this, pandemic, and we can't leave our houses. So we have to teach online, but you know what? After a while, you get the hang of it, and there's a learning curve, right, to everything we do, and eventually you get comfortable with it, and your students get comfortable with it, and you figure out, just like we did when we were first teaching, right, in face-to-face classes, you figure out what works and what doesn't work so much, and eventually you build up your confidence, and you build up your expertise and your ability to use the technology at your disposal to full effect. And eventually you feel great, right? You are an expert in teaching online. And for some of us, we don't get to miss the physical classroom so much anymore, right? Especially when you think about the commuting in a city like Lima, Peru, right? Where you can spend an hour and a half on a bus or 2 hours on a bus trying to get to where you work so you can teach an hour and a half of English. Right. So some things we won't really miss pre-pandemic, all right, like things like that. And again, you will build up your confidence and you'll feel a lot better. Let's look at number two. Comprehensible input is sufficient to learn or acquire, to acquire a second language. In other words, we just have to make sure that we're exposed to English as much as possible, whether it be through videos, whether it be through books, whether it be through online articles, the internet, YouTube, what have you. We just have to, that theoretically is sufficient to learn a second language. Now, that's the statement. I'd like you to think about that. Is that true? Is teaching really not that necessary? Can you learn a second language just by being exposed to comprehensible input? That's an interesting question. And I will shed some light on the answer based on my own personal experience. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's take a look at some information. In fact, let's listen to the person who came up with this idea. He wrote back in 1982, he wrote a manuscript called Second Language Acquisition, Second Language Learning. And in it, he postulated 5 hypotheses, one of which was the input hypothesis. These are the 5 hypotheses that made him famous, right? The natural order hypothesis, the monitoring hypothesis, the acquisition learning hypothesis, and I'm missing one, the affective filter hypothesis. Those were all presented in that manuscript. And the input hypothesis basically said, well, I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to let him tell you. Okay, so this is a video that goes, a very mature video. I'm not going to use the word old, but there is an expression for a video like this, an oldie but a goodie. Let's listen to Stephen Krashen. Okay, now those of us who have been in the field long enough know who Stephen Krashen is and his contributions to the field. Let's listen to him and what he says about comprehensible input and the learning process. And then we'll go back to that point that I made before, okay?
To begin my presentation this afternoon by talking about what I think is the most important issue in language education, the most important question, and that is, how do we acquire language? And I'd like to begin this discussion, this presentation, with an outrageous statement. In my opinion, we all acquire language the same way. The reason this is an outrageous thing to say is that these days in education, we're living in an age of individual variation. We're very concerned about how our students are different, not how our students are the same. Those who've been around in the field for a while remember, about 15, 20 years ago, people were very concerned about something called field-dependent learners and field-independent learners. You give people a certain test and one group gets this treatment, one group gets the other. Then about 15 years ago it was left side of the brain, right side of the brain. Some people are left hemisphere thinkers, some people are right hemisphere. Then about 10 years ago, cognitive style. The cognitive style of the home culture differs from the cognitive style of the school culture. We have a clash, etc. Well, each of the examples I gave you is probably correct. There is individual variation, and there is quite a bit of it. Nevertheless, there are some things we all do the same. Let me give you some examples. Digestion. We all digest food the same, no significant individual variation. First you put it in your mouth, then you chew it up, then it goes down your throat, then into your stomach. That's how it's done everywhere. That's how it's done in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa. That's how it's done everywhere in the world. The visual system's the same everywhere. It's always the occipital lobe in the back of the brain. It's never in the side of the brain. It's never in the front of the brain. It's never in the elbow. It's done exactly the same everywhere you go. By the way, I used to use sex as an example of things everyone does the same, but some counterexamples have been pointed out to me recently. Actually, I saw this movie, if you really want to know the truth. Anyway, we all acquire language the same, and rather than just talk about it, I'd like to show you. I'd like to take just a couple of minutes and give you some sample language lessons. I'll use a language that I'm sure you've heard before, and maybe some of you speak, and you can tell me which of these two very brief lessons you like better. Here's lesson number 1. Wir werden jetzt anfangen, Deutsch zu lernen. Und ich möchte im Voraus sagen, dass nach meiner Meinung Deutsch ist eine sehr schöne Sprache. Und ich hoffe, dass Sie alle sehr viel Erfolg mit Deutsch haben werden. What do you think? Good lesson so far? Do you think if I kept talking to you like that, you'd pick up German? Not very likely. How about if I repeated it? Would that help? Probably not. How about if I said it louder? Would that help? Probably not. How about if I said it and you repeated it back? Again, I don't think that would help. How about if I wrote it out for you and you could see it on your television screen? That wouldn't help either. How about if I wrote it out for you and you copied it down? How about if I wrote it out for you and deleted every 5th word and you tried to guess what the word is? The truth is that none of these things help. None of these things mean anything, and I hope you can see that now. Here's lesson number 2. And for this, you have to watch me carefully. Das ist meine Hand. Verstehen Sie das? Hand? Everyone say, ja, I can hear you, even though it's a TV audience. Good. Kopf. Das ist mein Kopf. Verstehen Sie Kopf? Ja? Gut. Kopf. And here I'll draw a picture now. Kopf. Ist gut, ja? Schön. Kopf. Das ist Mr. Spock, ja? Mr. Spock hat 2 Ohren. Ohren. Verstehen Sie Ohren? Er hat 2 Ohren. Okay, Mr. Spock. Ja? Ach, nein. Entschuldigung. Okay. Augen. Verstehen Sie Augen? Augen. Wie viele Augen? 1, 2, 3 Augen. 3 Augen. Ist das richtig? 3 Augen? Nein. Wir haben nur 2 Augen. Mund. Verstehen Sie Mund? Und hier ist eine Zigarette, ja? Nein. Zigaretten sind nicht gut. If you understood lesson number 2, not every word, but more or less, I did everything necessary to teach you German. And now I'm going to share with you the most important thing I have learned about language. Probably the best kept secret in the profession. We acquire language in one way and only one way, when we understand messages. We call this comprehensible input. We acquire language when we understand what people tell us, not how they say it, but what they say, or when we understand what we read. Comprehensible input, in my opinion, has been the last resort of the language teaching profession. We've tried everything else. We've tried grammar teaching, drills and exercises, computers, etc. But the only thing that seems to count is getting messages you understand, comprehensible input. Now, one of the reasons lesson number 2 was better than lesson number 1 is we had Mr. Spock to help us out. So anything that helps make input comprehensible, pictures, knowledge of the world, realia, etc., helps language acquisition. If comprehensible input is true, what we call the input hypothesis is true, other things follow from it. And a very important corollary of the input hypothesis is this, and this may come as a bit of a surprise to some of you. Certainly came as a surprise to me. Talking is not practicing. Talking is not practicing. What does this mean? It means if you want to improve your Spanish, it will not help you to speak Spanish out loud in the car as you drive to work in the morning. It will not help you to go to the bathroom, close the door, and speak Spanish to the mirror. I used to think those things help. Now I think they don't. On the other hand, if we were a German class and we could...
Okay, very good. So I needed to include that statement about talking. He said talking is not practicing. That's an important statement apart from everything he said in reference to comprehensible input, because I'm going to be talking about practice a little later. But anyway, 3 points here. Do you agree? Comprehensible input is what we need, is the main or perhaps the only real way to acquire language. Is that true? Is that a fact? Or is that a myth? Now remember, acquisition refers to your ability to assimilate language and incorporate it as part of your interlanguage. In other words, you have it in your mind available in long-term memory for spontaneous use anytime you need to communicate with somebody. That's acquired language, okay? So it's not language that is supposedly learned, because he does make a distinction between learned language and acquired language through his acquisition learning hypothesis. That's a whole other story I'm not going to get into tonight. But what do you think? Okay, so 3 seconds, myth or fact, come to a conclusion. What do you think? Do you agree with him? Do you agree with the idea that acquisition is sufficiently satisfied by providing comprehensible input? 3 points there. Number 1, acquisition means, as I said before, that you start building up a body of language in your mind that you are able to use as a resource for communication. This body of language that you create, that grows and expands over time as you are exposed to the language and as you are practicing it over and over again in different situations and contexts, is called the interlanguage. This is a term that my friend Dr. Larry Selinker coined back in 1972. And this is a term that reflects our version of the second language that we're learning. And again, it's like the universe, right? It's constantly expanding. And so, in order to expand, you need to be exposed to language, and that's where comprehensible input comes in. But we have to remember that the main goal for learning a second language, acquiring, and we want to be really specific, using the terms that Stephen Krashen resorts to, is to communicate with other people. So we need to speak to others to communicate. We need to write, of course, as well, because we have to communicate a message. Messages can only be communicated through speaking and writing, okay? If we are conveying something we want to get out to other people. So that's number 1. So input, now there we're going to build on that, and there's something called the output hypothesis. Just like we have the input hypothesis, we have something called the output hypothesis, and this was coined by Dr. Meryl Swain. She's a Canadian researcher who has specialized for many years in immersion situations where people acquire language through an immersion environment. And she postulated the output hypothesis, which means that people acquire language as they use it. And whenever communication runs into some difficulty, you have to reformulate, right? This is called negotiation of meaning. She says that process in and of itself contributes to second language acquisition, and it is required. Plus the fact that we have to use language, especially the mental process behind speaking, is something that contributes to second language acquisition. And I think we all would agree that it's not enough just to have people exposed to comprehensible input and quietly nod yes. How do we make sure if they really did acquire language, if they learned the language? We have to have them practice it with other members of the class, right? So we have to make sure they're able to use it to communicate. And third, and this is the point that Krashen did refer to, talking is not practicing. We have to find the right kind of practice. Okay, so in class, what we do want to do is we want to maximize the ability of students to use the language by speaking in different situations, not just the communicative activities that we use, right? But we also want to get them to apply the language, explaining how it works. So for example, if we're teaching grammar, we want the students to explain it to us. We shouldn't be doing all the explaining, especially if the class is aiming to be student-centered. And so when students tell us, for example, let's say you're the teacher and you say, hey, I'd like you to who can tell me how we form the past tense of regular verbs? Jose raises his hand and he says, teacher, the past tense of regular verbs you form with the ed. You put ed final part, at end. Very good, Jose. That's right. To form a verb in a regular verb in the past, you have to use ed. Good job. So that's called meta language. And also we have something called classroom language, right? So classroom language is when students are talking to each other and they're comparing answers. And you say, Maria and Jaime are working together. Maria says, hey, what do you have for number one? And Jaime says, I have A. Oh, I have letter B. Why do you have A? Well, I have A because. And so they're talking. Or Jaime says, teacher, I don't understand. Can you explain again? Or teacher, may I go to the restroom? Right? So these are all examples of classroom language, which facilitates our daily interactions in our lessons. And of course, meta language, classroom language, and what I call interactional language, which is what we normally traditionally see in communicative activities. All the three promote student talk time, and they promote also, they contribute to acquisition, right? So the three together is what I call the speaking triad, all right? And you have a lot of techniques that you can use to promote speaking. So communicative language, classroom language techniques, or CLTs, cooperative learning techniques, which are CLTs, and classroom interaction techniques are CITs. Okay, so these are things that we can do to get people to deepen their understanding of how language works and to get them to use it effectively for communication in class. Now, when we're looking at practice, I'll tell you a story. A few years ago, I organized one of the 6 ELT Horizons conferences when I was working at another language center. And I had Dr. Rod Ellis, and Penny Erb was also participating in that conference. Now, Dr. Rod Ellis is an SLA theorist and researcher, and Penny Erb is a world-renowned methodologist, and they're both English. They're both from England. Dr. Rod Ellis has been living in New Zealand for about 40 years, and Penny Erb has been living in Israel for about the same time, a little less. And so they got into this interesting debate about practice and the right kind of practice. So this is what Stephen Krashen just mentioned in the video. And the night before, Dr. Rod Ellis, he told me an interesting story. He said, listen, Leo, the expression practice makes perfect? Well, it doesn't make perfect. I said, what do you mean, Rod? I mean, everybody says it. He said, yeah, let me tell you a story. He said, you remember when England played, I forgot the team. I think it might have been, I don't remember the team, but they were playing somebody. And, they were practicing. This was in the World Cup, in the 2006 World Cup. And so England was practicing because, sometimes these games are very tight and they end in a tie. And so in order to break the tie, sometimes you have to resort to penalty kicks or penalty shots. So he was telling me how the English team, or the team from England, the national team from England, they were practicing the whole week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, in case the game on Saturday ended in a tie. So they wanted to be ready if they had to go to penalty kicks. And so they were practicing the whole week, and they were perfect. One shot in, another shot in, another shot in. So they were ready. So the game comes on Saturday, and guess what? It ends in a tie. They had to go to penalty kicks. And guess what? England missed 4 out of the 5 kicks. Okay. And he says, Leo, there you go. You see, practice doesn't make perfect. What makes perfect is the right kind of practice. Eventually, Pennier and Rod Ellis came to the same conclusion. They came to an agreement. The debate came to an end. And Rod Ellis explained what I'm going to show you now. The right kind of practice that contributes to second language acquisition the most, according to Dr. Rod Ellis, and I know him personally. You got to believe him. He knows what he's talking about. He's been in the field for so many years, and he's contributed so much. There's something he calls plan, focus on form, which is one of the three different types of form focused instruction according to taxonomy that he devised back in the year 2001. There's an article if you look for it. And so basically what he's saying is we should get students to practice in using communicative activities where their focus is on meaning and meaning only, right? They're focused on meaning. But the activity is designed in such a way so that they are required to use a specific form to do the activity or the task successfully. Now, if in their attempts, they can do it most of the time, they can do it well most of the time, that if you do it long enough and as many times as possible over the course of a study program, that will also contribute significantly to the second language acquisition. Now, let's take a look at an example. We have two pictures here, picture A and picture B. What I would like you to do, I'm going to ask you a simple question, okay? Can you tell me the differences between picture A and picture B? Okay, so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to type your answers in the chat box, and you can do something as simple as saying, in picture A, the man is, okay, but in picture B, etc. And you can finish, okay? So I'll give you 2 minutes. I'd like you to come up with at least 3 differences between picture A and picture B, and we'll look at them together. And then you'll know what I mean, okay? I'll explain it to you. So let's do that. 2 minutes. Try to find at least 3 differences between the 2 pictures. Okay, you have 1 more minute. Very good. Again, doing a good job writing some examples there in the chat box so we can go over them together. "30 seconds. Okay, here we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, time is up. That was German, by the way. At least I tried to try German there. I got inspired by Stephen Krashen after his lesson, so I gave it a shot with my German, my very rustic and rusty German. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's see what we can come up with. How many differences? So in picture A, the man is eating a banana, but in picture B, he's eating an apple. In picture A, the boys are playing soccer, but in picture B, they're playing tennis. In picture A, excuse me, there's a typo. The woman is wearing a red shirt, and aqua green pants. But in picture B, she's wearing a white t-shirt and black pants. And we could go on. There are several other differences. My question to you now, what grammatical structure do we need or do we see here time and time again? Can you type it? Very good. The present progressive or the present continuous. Now, if we go back to the beginning just a few minutes ago, we're going to remember that I never asked you to use the present progressive or the present continuous. The only thing I asked you was find at least 3 differences between picture A and picture B. Now, this was a writing task. It could have been a speaking task. Either way, the goal was the same. I needed you to focus on meaning, to convey to me, your teacher, or maybe your partner, if we worked in pairs, to find the differences and to state them. But you weren't thinking about grammar. You were thinking about the actual examples. So that's the point. This kind of activity is the kind of activity that contributes to second language acquisition the most. Okay? So speaking of grammar, here's another point. And this is interesting because, you know, it's become mainstream teaching, this whole notion of inductive teaching and learning. So let me say the statement and then you can think about it for a few seconds. Inductive teaching is better than explicit teaching. Okay, so inductive is more indirect, remember? So inductive is when we are resorting to a source of input that contains a target language. If the target language is highlighted, we call it structured input. If the target language is not highlighted, we call it input flood, okay? And so input flood, you don't really see any reference to the target language, but there are a lot of examples. So the idea is that in both cases, you're supposed to figure out the target language, right? And you are supposed to arrive at your own conclusions in terms of what the target language is and how it works. Explicit teaching is more traditional. So this is when we're teaching grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. And we come up with the traditional approach. We say, hey, today we're going to learn the present perfect. Present perfect is formed by subject plus have or has plus a verb in the past participle, right? And then we go and we start explaining and giving examples, blah, blah, blah. So that's explicit teaching compared to inductive teaching. Okay, so what do you think? Let me give you some info first before you arrive at your conclusion. Okay, so remember that with inductive teaching and learning, what we do is we usually present, maybe it's a reading, it might be a dialogue, and it contains the target language. Okay, and the benefits are supposed to be that the inductive approach allows the students to arrive at their own conclusions and figure out how the language works, rather than being served on the platter and not being given a chance to think about how it works out, right? So this promotes higher level thinking. It makes it deeper. It makes the understanding, allegedly, it makes the understanding deeper of the target language that we're trying to teach. And the criticism with the explicit teaching approach is that it's too teacher-centered. Sometimes, when we're teaching grammar, we get to talk too much, right? And the lessons are a little long, right? Whereas inductive teaching is student-centered. The students are the main protagonists. They work together. They figure out the language. That is the main criticism, okay, of explicit versus implicit or inductive teaching. So what do you think? Is inductive better or not? Can you write myth or fact? Is it a myth? Is explicit teaching actually better than inductive? What do you think? Or is it a fact? Now, most of you will try to think about what's worked for you in the classroom. I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about it. Write your answer. Some of you will write your answer right away. Okay. why don't we watch a video first? And then what we're going to do is we're going to go into it. Okay, let's watch a video grammar lesson. And this is from one of our teacher training courses. Let's watch a video and we'll see how this works. Okay. Okay, so let's give it, there we go.
All right, everybody, great job. It looks like you really understand the new grammar. There is and there are. So let's take it the next step. We looked at the examples in the book. They're not very exciting. Let's personalize the grammar. And that's what it's all about. You need to personalize the communicator. I want you to look at these examples. There is shopping mall. There is great restaurant. There are volcanoes. And there are dance clubs. I want you to think about examples that would use these words, but in Peru. It could be Lima, or it could be any other place in the country. I want you to think for about a minute and write down some ideas as you're thinking. Okay? Good. I was walking around, I saw some great examples. Let's see if you can write them on the board. Ingrid, why don't you give us one for shopping mall? How about you do that? Okay, these look really great. All right. Who did the first one with shopping mall? Was that you, Ingrid? Ingrid, could you read your example out loud, please?
There is a shopping mall on Salaberry Avenue.
Great, the pronunciation is really good. But can you give me a little more information, extra information?
This shopping mall is called Real Plaza, and you can find there good deals.
Okay, that is really good for there is. Let's look at there are, and this example with volcanoes. I think that was you here. Here, can you read this aloud first?
There are volcanoes in Arequipa.
Good, pronunciation is great there too. Now, read it again and give me a little more information.
Yes, teacher. There are volcanoes in Arequipa. They are Misty, Chachani, and Pichu Pichu.
All right, so we had an international class. We were talking about, let me go back. We were talking about Misty, Chachani, and Pichu Pichu in Arequipa. Arequipa is the neighboring country that so many of us love very much. Anyway, so in terms of whether it's a myth or a fact, a couple of things very quickly. The main principle here is that we always want the class to be student-centered, whether that be virtual or be in a physical class. So we always want, one of the main aims for any teacher is to make sure that the class is always student-centered. An inductive approach will always make a class more student-centered, okay? So remember that the whole notion, we look at Schmidt's noticing hypothesis from 1993. This is when it was first introduced. That's another aspect of the acquisition process that's considered fundamental. We want students to notice the language, how it's used, specifically the target language. If the input is carefully chosen or put together, if it's crafted, then it will help students figure out, come to their own conclusions. So this thinking process, working together with a peer, working together in a group, and trying to figure out how the target language works, the language has been introduced in the input, that helps a great deal, number one. It makes the class more student-centered, number two. Number three, the research shows that an inductive approach can be more helpful in helping students understand and process grammar and vocabulary, some pronunciation features, especially at lower levels, basic, intermediate. However, this tends to occur, now this is what the research says, this tends to occur more with higher frequency forms. With lower frequency, higher complexity forms, so for example, cleft sentences, right? The mixed conditional, future perfect, it is better to actually work with an explicit approach. So the definitive answer is, in general, especially at lower levels, an inductive approach is very, very helpful. and it's very good, and it is appropriate, and it should be the first step you should follow. However, with the more complicated, the more complex, the more challenging grammatical structures, we should focus primarily on explicit teaching. That seems to work better. Okay, so it's a mix. The final point is, and this is what nobody else is going to tell you, that when you follow an inductive approach, eventually it's inevitable. Inductive goes to explicit. It has to. Why? Because the inductive approach, when we want students to notice the language in the target input or the target language in the input, we want to encourage students, and this is by definition, this is the actual definition. We want students to hypothesize, speculate, ponder on the possibility of how the language may work. Okay, and this is the mental process that helps the student grasp the form, meaning, and use of the target language, and then to kind of assimilate it, right? But remember, it's hypothesizing on the part of the students. And when you're hypothesizing, you still need a confirmation. And so the confirmation inevitably will have to come from the teacher. So you do have an inductive stage, but eventually you have to go explicit to confirm the hypotheses. In other words, the teacher will have to clarify and openly confirm or not whether the students' hypotheses were accurate or inaccurate, and to kind of help them consolidate, if they were, how it actually works. So they actually tend to happen always together. It's not like it's only one and not the other. They actually go together if it's done correctly. Okay? Okay. So that's another point that's often discussed in the field, and I'm hopping all over the place here. Number 4. Okay, well, we have 2 more to go after this. Number 4, textbooks don't reflect a student's reality or interests. Now, textbooks. We've been working with the printed textbooks, right? With the pages. So, right, we got our books with the covers, the nice covers, and we work with the publishers, and I love the publishers. And I've worked with many different publishers over the years. Remember, I was a director of studies or an academic director, so I had to choose different books along with my teachers and coordinators. So we work with a lot of different books. And so books are good, because remember that textbooks are created by people who specialize in designing content that gets people to learn and practice to the best of their ability and to their fullest potential. These are specialists. That's why we don't have teachers all over the world making up their own courses, right? Each and every time they get together with students, because it would be a disaster. So textbooks make our lives easier because they're tools, they're very useful, and they're made by specialists. However, one of the criticisms of textbooks is that they don't always reflect students' reality or interests. So is that true, or is it not true? Are textbooks beyond that today in the year 2021? Is this basically a false statement? Is it a myth, or is it still kind of true? What do you think? Think about that as I move to the next slide. And then we'll see, and let me give you some more information, and we'll see what we come up with. So number 1, you got to remember, textbooks generally are created in some central location, right? Or you might have authors in different cities, but they all report to one centralized location, and they assemble books that are broken down to different levels. I know about this because, again, I've worked very closely with different publishers. And so it's a one-size-fits-all approach sometimes. Nowadays, publishers have become more flexible. They've had to adapt their textbooks depending on the markets. This is especially true when it comes to the Middle East, for example. In the Middle East, you cannot sell a textbook the way you normally would sell it to Peru or the United States. It has to be adapted because there are some cultural issues. So you have to make sure that they are culturally acceptable. You can't put certain things in their books, or they won't sell. First of all, they won't let them in the country, okay? But in general, yeah, textbooks are created a certain way. So when you analyze them, it's kind of like, it's almost like a one-size-fits-all. Let's make this textbook and get it out there, and whoever buys it, fine. Whoever doesn't buy it, well, then they'll find something else, but we'll try to sell it anyway. I do remember I had I won't say the name, and I won't name the publisher, and I won't name the author. But I had breakfast one morning. We were analyzing different options for books, and it was at a nice hotel. And then we were having breakfast, and I said to the author of the book, and this guy's really, really famous. I said to him, I said, "Listen," I said, "your book is really nice. It's a nice book, but I'll be honest with you. The beginning level is kind of high. It's kind of high for A1, even false beginners. It's kind of high. If it's people below a false beginner level, your basic one course, it's way too high. So I would suggest, now, modesty aside, I took it upon myself. You know, I had a very friendly relationship with the publisher and with the author, and I said to him, I said, "Listen, why don't you guys consider this, depending on your potential customer?" This was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I said, "Listen, so why don't you have, content that adapts according to the level of the potential market, of the target market, or the target customer? So if your level would be normally too high, especially with huge customers." I remember in my case, I had just become academic director somewhere, and we had 30-something thousand students a month. And so this is a huge client. So in order not to risk the client, the idea was, hey, have something that can adapt. So you have 3 versions of the same activities for your book 1, a simpler version, an easier version, a little more challenging, and then a high level version. So you have your true beginner, halfway between true and false beginner, and then you're completely false beginner. That's number 1. And say, hey, that's a good idea. It's the year 2020. I still don't see that done on a massive scale. Number 2, design. Books are designed a certain way, and again, they try to appeal to as many people as possible. So it's difficult because remember, it's costly to put a textbook together. You have to create a textbook, and you have to put it together and assemble it and print it, and you can't make 15 different versions of the same textbook. It has to be designed in a way so that it appeals to as many people as possible. And then there's the issue of cultural imperialism. And this has come up before. This has come up at TESOL conventions and ITEFL conventions or conferences and other international conferences. And this is the concern on the part of people who say, listen, these textbooks, they don't do enough to reflect the local culture. They try to impose a quote unquote foreign culture. This doesn't reflect who we are as a people, as a country, and our culture. And so there are people who object to this. And I know some guy running around somewhere, this is all he talks about, cultural imperialism. He complains all the time. I run into this guy every now and then in different conferences, and all he complains about is cultural imperialism. So I can understand the sensitivity. So how do you get around that? That's the question. Do textbooks do enough? Well, okay. That's the question. Oops, hold on. Oh, I jumped ahead. So what do you think? Is it a myth or a fact? Type your answer, myth or fact. What do you think? This should be very interesting to figure out. Textbooks don't reflect student needs and interests enough. What do you say? Is that true? Is that a fact, or is it a myth? Okay. All right. We got about 35 minutes left, so I'm pretty sure I'll make it. So here we go. This is the answer. Again, I think textbooks are great. Most of the textbooks out there right now are really good. They're well put together. They make our lives a lot easier. They do the work. The people who put these textbooks together, they did the work that many of us would not be able to do. We don't have the time for it. We don't have the expertise for it. So the textbook, a good textbook, a textbook that's well designed, whether it be a physical textbook and now the ebooks that are being sold by publishers, they're good. And a lot of these activities are really, really good. But what I've been telling my teachers for the longest time, and I've told thousands of teachers that I've worked with, I said, listen, no textbook is perfect. Okay, no textbook is perfect. And so when you analyze, every time you get together, every time you plan for your lesson the night before or 2 nights before, and you look at your book and you say, hey, this is what I'm going to do 2 days from now. This is what I'm going to do tomorrow. You got to ask yourself, first, of course, the learning objectives. Okay. The anticipated learning outcomes. What do you expect to see the next day? But you also have to look at the content. You have to tell yourself, is this going to work tomorrow? Yes or no? Will my students find this engaging? Yes or no? If the answer is no, I've always told my teachers, okay, and again, a lot of teachers over the years, I said, listen, replace it, modify the activity, change the names, change the places, change the tasks, omit what you need to omit, or replace the activity altogether with something of your own. And if you have extra time, bring your own activities. I've always encouraged teacher creativity and innovation. I think it's very, very important. I think we cannot just stick to a book, because if we stick to a book, classes become very, very boring, and you kill teacher ingenuity. You just kill it. Okay, and that's not good, because that eventually leads to burnout, which is a topic I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. Okay, we don't want that. So what you want to do is you want to complement the great content that you're getting from a fine textbook, which is not perfect. You want to complement it with content that students will be able to engage better. Okay, so for example, here, let's imagine that we're teaching this grammar. Subject plus to be plus as adjective, and of course the negative version is not as, adjective as. Who are these ladies? Who are these fine ladies? Can you tell me who they are? Now, they're Peruvian, so I'll give you that hint. You should know that. Now, for those of you who are from other countries, you won't be able to necessarily figure out who they are, but you'll be able to figure out the dynamic of what I'm trying to say here once I explain it. So who are these ladies? Good. So it's Lucia de la Cruz and Eva Young. Okay, these are two Peruvian folk music singers, or criolla music singers. Okay, they're very well known, both of them, very accomplished. And so if we want to compare them, we wanted to use the adjective good. Now we're talking about singing ability. The Peruvians in the audience, if you think they are equally good, okay? So Lucia is good and Eva is good. Then you have to say Lucia is as, finish the sentence, good, is as good as Eva. Now, if you want to put Eva the other way around, Eva is as good as Lucia. Now, if you don't agree, if you think there is a difference, then you have to use a negative statement. So normally I would ask, how many of you don't think they are the same? This is a little controversial. If you don't think they're the same, then you have to offer an example in the negative. So what is the example in the negative? Okay, some of you are going to put Eva first, and some of you are going to put Lucia first. Okay, so what's the example? I'll give you 15 seconds to write an example in the chat box, or come up with an example in your mind. And those of you who aren't Peruvian, you can also come up with a sentence, obviously. Okay. Okay. So, and I've done this in Mexico. I've changed the different names in Ecuador and Guatemala and all these other countries where I've given this talk, a version of this talk. This is a new version of my previous talk. But anyway, so it would be, for example, Eva is not as good as Lucia. Don't turn off your computer yet. I don't want to offend anybody. If you love Eva Young and you didn't like my sentence, don't worry. I'm going to give you the other version now, okay? Lucia is not as good as Eva. Okay, there we go. I made everybody happy. Okay, so nobody can turn off your computer. Nobody's going to disconnect. Nobody's going to send a complaint to ETP, all right, about this guy who's been criticizing Eva Young unfairly. No, I mean, this is just a grammar lesson. Okay, so now, what is the rationale here? We are Peruvianizing. We could be Mexicanizing. We can be Chilenizing. We can be Brazilianizing, etc. Colombianizing, Ecuadorianizing. Well, that's a little difficult. grammatical. Ecuadorianizing the lesson, because we want the student to understand the target language within the context of their own culture. Okay, so hold on a second. So we want the student to understand and to practice and to use the target language within the context of their culture. This Peruvianization is linked to something called schema theory. But before I explain that, let's watch a quick video, okay? And here's an example of a Peruvianized lesson from one of our courses for teachers where we work on English, and the students have to kind of assemble a recipe for ceviche. Ceviche is a very typical Peruvian dish. I know they have it in Colombia and Ecuador, Mexico, and other parts of Latin America, but it's a Peruvian, very famous Peruvian dish, the way it's prepared in Peru. Okay, so here we go, very quickly, a couple of minutes. Let's watch this class. Okay.
Please. We're
Okay.
going to listen to Katia right now, and then you can also participate in a little bit. What do we have to do first? Let's see.
Okay, let me tell you that I don't know how to cook very well ceviche, but I am going to try to do that. Okay, first you need to cut into a pieces the fish.
Okay.
You have to squeeze, then you have to squeeze the lemon.
Mm-hmm.
Some lemons, or the lime that as limes. Mr. Mercado told us that it is limes. So you have to squeeze limes in a bowl.
Okay.
And you add the fish, the pieces of fish.
Okay. All right, Katia. Let's have somebody else to help you too. Maybe since you say that you don't know how to do this very well, but it sounds good. You sound almost like a pro. But let's see if somebody else can help you too. Let's see. Who would like to help Katia? Nancy? Ala? Which one of you would like to help?
Yes, in my case, first,
Ala or Nancy?
Nancy.
Nancy. How would you help Katia? Yes.
In my case, first, we have to wash the fish.
Okay.
And chop the fish into cubes.
Yeah.
Chop the fish into cubes.
Right.
And the next step is to place the piece in the container that you are going to use to serve the dish.
Okay.
And the following step is to mix the fish with the chopped yellow chili and coriander.
Okay, coriander, yes.
Yes, and after that, we should put the onion cuts into julienne strips.
Okay, in julienne, yes, okay.
All right, so a couple of things here. We're talking about julienne strips, which is not what no textbook is going to teach you. Well, again, the notion is, and this is based on schema theory, Piaget, this notion that new things are learned easier, more quickly, assimilated into long-term memory better if they are associated with things we have experienced in life, okay? Things that are relevant to us, things from our culture, from our everyday lives, very personal. So if we can link it to something that, because if it's abstract, if we were talking about a dish like veal scalope, people will be like, okay, it says veal scalope in the book, but who cares? I never heard of that dish before, right? But I do know ceviche. I know what ceviche has. I know what it contains. I know more or less how to make it. I know more or less how it I know how it tastes. So as a Peruvian student, I would be able to speak more easily about ceviche. I'd be able to speak more easily, connect the new language to Eva Young and connect the new language to Paolo Guerrero, etc. Right? Or if I'm in Mexico, to Luis Miguel, right? Or the tacos and there's a delicious breakfast that I can't remember right now. But anyway, you get my meaning. So it's easier for you to talk about these things because you live them, you eat them, you taste them, you see them, you admire them because they're from your own culture. Okay, so this is very important. It makes language more easy or easier to learn. And again, Peruvianization, Colombianization, whatever it may be, ties into schema theory. Now, number 5, this is the second to last one. Reading aloud is good. Now, how many of you have your students read aloud or used to have your students read aloud, depending on, this is more common in the face-to-face class. We can also do it in the virtual class. I'd like to know how many of you have your students read aloud. Reading aloud is good. Now, I know a lot of people do it because I've seen it. I've observed thousands of classes over the years, so I know people do it. But they don't always do it the same way. There are different ways to do it. But in general, do you agree that reading aloud is good? Is that based on fact? Or is it more of a myth? What do you think? That's the question to think about. What do you think? Is it a fact or more? Okay. Let me give you some info. Now, be careful. Now, don't always trust me. You can't always trust me. I might be trying to throw you off here. The main reason people do reading aloud in class, one of the main reasons when you interview people and you talk to teachers, you say, hey, why do you do this reading aloud for? Especially when you're doing the feedback after a class, right? You do the post-observation conference. You tell teachers, say, hey, so what was your idea? Why did you have your students read aloud? They're going to tell you, the first thing they're going to tell you is, well, I wanted them to practice their pronunciation. Right? So how many of you would say the same thing? Right? Yeah, okay. So a lot of people say they do it to get people to practice their pronunciation. The second reason that I hear a lot, or that well, again, we're kind of in a vacuum in these 4 or 5 months with the pandemic, but up to the pandemic, what I always used to hear all the time was, well, it was a way to motivate students to be the protagonists, to put the student at the center of the class. So this would motivate students because they would get all the attention. So again, pronunciation and motivation, those were the two main reasons. So what do you think? Is it a myth or a fact? Do you agree with those reasons? And I'll clarify it in a second. Okay, so you have to come into a conclusion, and you have to tell me what you think. Yeah. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to give you the 4 P's to give you an answer. Okay. You have to remember, when you have your students working with a reading text, the main reason we're working with a reading text, you should never forget this, is not to practice pronunciation. The main reason we work with a reading text is first and foremost to get students to develop their reading comprehension skills. Top down, bottom up. Okay, so that is the main reason we work with the text. Texts are not put in the course book, they're not put in your ebook, they're not put on a platform necessarily. Well, platform is a little different. Platforms are a little more versatile. So platforms, what they'll do is they'll get you to focus on comprehension first, and then they'll have a section on pronunciation. But in general, the main reason a textbook has a reading activity is so that you can get the students to practice their reading develop their reading comprehension skills. Number 1. Number 2, the procedure. The procedure for a reading task is for a reading activity. You usually start off with a pre-reading discussion. Now, that's standard practice, right? So when you analyze these activities, whether they're in a course book or whether they're in on a platform, the first thing you usually see is the pre-reading discussion. The main purpose of a pre-reading discussion is not to produce target grammar. It's not to practice pronunciation. It's not to give the teacher to apply corrective feedback. The main reason that we do pre-reading discussions is to engage the students with the topic of the lesson, with the topic of the reading text, okay, that's being presented, right? So that's the main reason. So what we do is we do the pre-reading discussion, then we look at we give the students a chance to look at the text, maybe the headline, so they can predict what the text is about, and then we give them time to read the text carefully, quietly. We go into the tasks, the exercises, and then we have a more open discussion on the text. That's the typical sequence. Now, so what teachers often do, if they're going to do reading aloud, they'll do the reading discussion, the pre-reading discussion, and then they'll jump into the reading aloud. Okay, so there's a couple of things there. Number one, if you're going to practice on pronunciation, we have to go back to Krashen's input hypothesis. Now remember that comprehensible input by definition is slightly above the productive level of a student. And if you look at the texts in the typical textbook at the different levels, whether it's a basic 1, basic 4, basic 8, basic 10, intermediate 4, intermediate 6, intermediate 8, advanced 1, or whatever the level is, depending on where you're studying. The text is largely comprehensible if it's well chosen. Students will understand most, if not all, the words. Theoretically, they're supposed to understand at least 95% of the words for it to be used in the textbook. But maybe many of those words they've never pronounced before. So they'll understand it. They'll see it on the paper. They'll identify it. They'll know the meaning. They'll comprehend it, but they've never pronounced it before. So if you call on them, what usually happens? Let's go to the last part, participation. What you do is you call on one person at a time. So say, Jose, why don't you read paragraph number 1? So Jose starts reading, the poor guy. And then you say, hey, wait, Jose, it's not disappointing, it's disappointing. Repeat. Okay, so poor Jose says, oh, I made a mistake. Okay, teacher, disappointing. Okay, continue. So Jose's continuing. Oh, Jose. It's not severe, it's severe. Repeat, severe. And the poor guy, everybody's looking at the guy, and then the teacher's like, he does this 5 or 6 times. And so, yeah, Jose's getting a lot of attention, but he's getting the wrong kind of attention. He's getting the attention that puts him on the spot. They're highlighting, the teacher's highlighting the errors, the mistakes. And it's not Jose's fault. He's never read these words before. So, number 1. Number 2, while Jose is reading in a class that you'll find in most language institutes with 25 students, I don't know how they do it with 25 students, there's 1 student participating and 24 others who aren't. So 4% of the class is participating, 96% is not. Now, you're hoping to goodness that the 96% are paying attention to Jose, but chances are some of those students are probably in La La Land, or they're daydreaming, or they're texting the boyfriend or the girlfriend, and they're not really engaged. So that's a problem. Now, does that mean you can't do reading aloud? No. What it means is you can do it if you do it under the right conditions, if you follow the procedure correctly. The correct procedure is something we call shadow reading, where the teacher provides the model first. I'm not going to go into that too much, but you must model it first. The students read along quietly, then you read it again, and the students read while moving their lips. They don't articulate, they just move their lips. And then the third time they read together with the teacher, the 4th time they read together. And then if you want, you can call on individual students, even though by then it's not really the point. You just want to double check and make sure that, they got the main idea. So there is a procedure to do it, okay? Okay, so that's the thing. Now, reading fluency is something we normally don't cover in class. Actually, I still have yet to see a textbook that proactively promotes the development of reading fluency. You don't see it in any textbook. So what I'm doing is I'm going to show you a technique, repeated reading. The last time I saw this demonstrated in Peru, it was by Dr. Frederica Stoller and Bill Grabby. William, spelled Grabe, but it's pronounced Grabby. And they were here in Lima. I brought them to Lima some time ago, and they were talking about, they're specialists in reading, comprehension, developing reading skills, reading literacy. And they have some books and researched on the issue, on the matter. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to read this text, and I'm going to read it very calmly, okay? And I will read it for 60 seconds. And then what you're going to do is you're going to do the same thing. You're going to read it for 60 seconds. I'm going to say stop. The first time you stop, I want you to make a note of the last word that you read aloud. And then we're going to do it again. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to wait till this thing says 30 seconds, and I'll know exactly where I am because I'm keeping track. I've been talking for 1 hour and 23 minutes, and I have 1 hour and 45 before the questions arrive. So, okay, so here we go. Joe Biden heads into the weekend weighing the biggest decision of his presidential campaign so far, And people close to the process tell CNN that the former vice president is believed to have now begun to narrow his personal shortlist of potential running mates to a handful of women. In more than 24 interviews with CNN in recent days, members of Congress, top Democratic donors, Biden allies, and others close to the vice presidential vetting process said California Representative Karen Bass, the 66-year-old chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, has gained real traction in the late stage of the search. Amid furious last-minute lobbying and speculation about Biden's historic decision, California Senator Kamala Harris and Susan Rice, Barack Obama's former national security advisor, believed to be among the most serious contenders. I'll stop there. That was 60 seconds. So I stopped at contenders. I'd like you to do the same, okay? You're going to start when I say go, and you're going to begin with Joe Biden. Go. Stop. Okay. Take a note of the words, and then now I'm going to try to read a little faster. I'm going to try to move beyond contenders. So I'm going to do this a little faster. I'm not going to be speeding Gonzalez, but I need to read it faster. So here we go. Joe Biden heads into the weekend, weighing the biggest decision of his presidential campaign so far. And people close to the process tell CNN that the former vice president is believed to have now begun to narrow his personal shortlist of potential running mates to a handful of women. In more than 24 interviews with CNN in recent days, members of Congress, top Democratic donors, Biden allies, and others close to the vice presidential vetting process said California Representative Karen Bass, the 66-year-old chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, has gained real traction in the late stage of the search. Amid furious last-minute lobbying and speculation about Biden's historic decision, California Senator Kamala Harris and Susan Rice, Barack Obama's former national security advisor, are also believed to be among the most serious contenders. The search continues to be conducted under extreme secrecy, with even many top campaign advisors in the dark about the vetting process. Several additional women have also gone through extensive examination by the Biden team, including Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, Florida Representative Val Demings, and I'll stop right there. So I stopped at Val Demings. So the first time I did it I ended at contenders, and now I ended at Val Demings. So I made some progress into the third paragraph. Now you're going to do the same thing. We're going to begin again in about 9 seconds. I want you to go faster, just like I did, and we'll see how far you go. Go. Stop. Okay, how far did you get? So the point here is, this is something called repeated reading, as I said before, and usually you do it 5 or 6 times. A couple of things here. You want to move beyond that, and there's going to be a point where you can't move any further. And so what you're trying to develop here is reading fluency. Now, in order to develop reading fluency, you want to increase your words per minute. You want your students to increase their ability to read a certain number of words per minute over time. Now, the research shows that a good target for a B1 level student, which is a consolidated intermediate level, is about 200 words per minute at 70% comprehension. Now, if you work with the right text, you'll probably usually get 98 or higher, right? 98 or higher in terms of percentage. Ideally, if you want to work with fluency, you want the text to be 98% understood. So most of the words, almost 98 out of every 100 words are words that the student is familiar with and knows the meaning. And ideally, you want a reading that is at the level I+0 or even below the level I-1. And then you have a reference to native speakers. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea. Repeated reading is a very effective technique. Final myth or fact: teachers will teachers will get burned out eventually. There is not much we can do about that except find new ones. Now, this sounds like a coordinator or a director that's ready to give up very easily. But anyway, getting burned out means this is a very real phenomenon that occurs with teachers. It occurs in all the professions, but it's particularly noticeable in teachers when, after a while, after several years, maybe after many years, teachers lose interest. They're not motivated anymore. They get negative. They turn negative. They get skeptical. They lose a drive to continue learning, to continue improving. They're not happy with their classes. They're not happy where they work. They complain a lot. That's a burned out teacher. Okay, we do get them. Okay, it doesn't matter where you are, where you work. I remember I was a director for thousands of teachers at 2 different institutions. And it is a phenomenon that happens, and it's not easy to work with that. You have to deal with it, especially if you want, you're aiming for an international accreditation, like I did on 2 occasions with the 2 different institutions that I worked with before. So a couple of things here. What is burnout? What are its causes? And what can you do? I think the last point is the most important, because you don't want to turn. We all watch, The Walking Dead, and if you get bitten by a zombie, you turn, right? You turn within hours, or you turn within a day. You become a zombie yourself. You don't want to become a burned out teacher. So what can you do? What does the research say? Well, a couple of things. That there's a very high percentage of teachers who leave the profession. They leave their institutions within the first 5 years. This goes back many years, goes back 20 years. I've been doing research and trying to figure out why teachers leave and how quickly they leave. The institutions where they work, and even the field, they go to work in something else. They leave teaching altogether. One of the main reasons is in their first year at their new institution, they don't get support. So it's vital to give teachers support in their first year. Any institution, now those of you who are coordinators in the audience, you have to give your new teachers support. The induction year, their first year, is when everything is new to them and they're finding it very difficult to adapt to what is a seemingly very new environment, very strange world. They don't know anybody. They have no friends. They don't know the rules. And so if you don't give them the support that is so vital in that first year, they're probably not going to last. They're going to drop out very quickly. Those teachers who have been at an institution for many years, if they've been doing the same thing for many years, that's a problem, okay? Because then it becomes very routine, very, very mundane, the work that they're doing. They find no satisfaction, no fulfillment. So what can you do? Well, research shows that you need to join a professional learning community. Now, for example, in NYC Learning Solutions, our programs for teachers, we create professional learning communities where teachers can interact with each other and they can have access to a lot of different resources and everything. Be different, make it interesting, introduce variety. Don't always do the same thing. Try out new things. Work with your students. Ask your students. Do a needs analysis. A very basic step that a lot of people don't do. Do a needs analysis. Find out what your students really enjoy, and align your lessons to that. and set your learning goals as a professional. One of the biggest things that I know from experience over the years of working with thousands of teachers and going through 2 different international accreditation processes, one, an international one that was based out of the US, another one that was based out of the UK, is that teachers need to feel like they're growing. They need to find opportunities for professional development. And they need to feel like there's always something new on the horizon. That's why I always used to meet with my teachers. I always, every year, at the beginning of every year, establishing and setting forth the goals and the objectives for the year and how we were going to work together, reaching out to teachers, helping them grow, get better, be aware of it, and moving forward with clearly defined goals. And so this whole notion of embracing learning as a lifelong endeavor and providing teachers with the opportunities to do it is vital if we are going to effectively treat or work with teacher burnout. So to finalize, to finish, fortunately in this day and age where everything is online, you can find options to work with online courses that can help you improve your expertise and obtain an international certification. So for example, we offer online courses in a variety of different areas, speaking and listening, technology. We offer corrective feedback, maximizing student talk time. We offer language assessment courses, language assessment. We even have courses for coordinators which are very interactive. They are personalized. Here, for example, we see context on how to teach grammar related to Bolivia, Santa Cruz, and La Paz. Real class videos that show you how the techniques are shown, how to apply the techniques, and so on. Interviews with teachers from all over the world and such. So 70%, this is what I said in my introduction, 70% at the beginning on that video that you had on the group's page, 70% of what we do as teachers is based on habit, and 30% is based on creative enterprise. So I'm paraphrasing John Fanslow, because John Fanslow is a world-renowned figure in the field, and he was a mentor to my friend Dr. Robert Oprandi from the University of Columbia, or Columbia University, excuse me, and then the University of San Francisco. And John Fanslow, he's done a lot of work in working with teachers, people like Julian Edge as well, and many others. And so this is important. A lot of the things that we do when we teach, whether it's online or whether it's face-to-face, is habit, because once you learn something, you don't think about it anymore. You're not consciously thinking about how you're going to do it. Just do it, because you know that a lead-in comes in first as you transition from another activity. You know you have to do a pre-reading discussion before you go into a text. You know you have to give students an opportunity to report if they're working on groups. And some of these things we do automatically. So those are the habits. We want to make sure that the habits are good ones, not bad ones, of course. And then the 30% is this constant dedication to creating and trying new things. That will keep you going, learning, feeling great, getting new certificates in your professional development, always feeling like you're moving forward. This is so important. The same applies to your language proficiency and learning how to develop your language proficiency. So a couple of things here before we go to the questions. Number one, I'd like to thank you, all right? I'd like to thank you for participating in this presentation. And if you'd like a copy of the presentation, you can write to this email address right here, and I'd be happy to send you a copy of the presentation for having participated today. Okay, so again, I represent NYC Learning Solutions, but I have worked in the field for about 25 years. Thanks to the introduction to Nefti, she mentioned that. And so it was a pleasure to be here with you today. And I think we do have time for questions. So I will leave it open to the question and answer stage here. And okay, I'm all ears. And I finished just right on time, even though I started a little later, but I finished exactly at 7:45. I am now at your disposal. So if the moderators would like to forward some questions, I'm right here. And let me put the email address. There we go. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mercado. Please, Miss Maite, you can start with the question, please. Can you read some question?
Yes, Miss. Hello, Mr. Mercado. And
Hello.
an interesting topic today. It's necessary to know also our own myths or facts in our development.
Yes, certainly.
We really appreciate your kindness today.
Thank
So,
you. I appreciate your participating. Thank you.
We have some questions not only from Peru.
Good.
Rosemary Marquez say, what happens if students don't have a laptop?
Yeah, so this is what I was talking about at the beginning. There's this notion of accessibility and making sure that everybody has an opportunity to participate. Now, we're in a time when the only way to participate in the learning process is by way of connecting to a shared learning environment by way of the internet, and somebody does not have a device. A couple of things. For example, in the U.S., what are they doing in the U.S.? And this is something that is really out of the hands of each individual. Unless they had a relative that they could go to, which is difficult in this time of age because they don't like people to go from one place to another. But for example, in the U.S., what they're doing is for those who do not have access to their own devices at home, at certain educational institutions, at certain schools, and in certain states, they establish workstations with computers for those who don't have one at home. So they can go to the school with the social distancing, following the whole security protocol, making sure that they're wearing masks, that they're maintaining the 6-foot distance between one person and another. But they provide the devices so that the student can still participate, even if they don't have something at home. The other option, now, if that's not being provided here, depending on the country where you are, it'd be a good idea to find out if that is being offered as an option. It's my understanding in Peru, it's not. It should, if under certain conditions, because if you don't take proactive action to make sure that the classes and the educational process is available to everyone, you're leaving people out. And remember, we've been in this for 4 or 5 months. And so can you imagine somebody not being able to participate in the educational process simply because they don't have the device? So in that case, again, the option is one, what they're trying in the US. The other one is trying to see if a relative may have a device that they might be able to lend, or they might be able to go to the relative's house but you can't really participate if you don't have the device. That's the only unfortunate thing about this. The problem with the situation that we're in right now is that in order to access the online learning environment, you need a device, whether it be a computer, whether it be a tablet, or whether it be a phone. In all 3 cases, depending on the complexity of the software being used, you can even use a phone. If it's a phone, it will depend very much on the internet access and the bandwidth that is part of the plan. But I would strongly suggest to find as many alternatives as possible. There are some NGOs that also offer loan devices to those who are in need to be able to participate in the educational process and don't have a device at home or don't have internet access. It'd be a matter of finding out. But yes, it is very difficult. In the case of somebody who doesn't have access, unfortunately, the way things are, by now you would have hoped that the governments, whether they be the local government or the city government or the state government or the federal government or the national government, in the case of Peru and other countries in Latin America, that they would have taken actions by now. For example, we do know that the national government here has proceeded with the tablets, but the tablets have yet to be distributed. And the tablets must have content, and the tablets must also have access to the internet. So those are issues that unfortunately are difficult to overcome. But yes, that's about as much as we can do considering the current circumstances. But it is vital for somebody to have a device to be able to access the learning process for language, and of course for other subject areas as well.
Thank you, teacher. Charo Matias, comment. In Dominican Republic, we don't have enough resources and we have to work and look at the materials that we have surrounding according to the diversity. What is your opinion about that?
Okay, so so in other words, that the content, there isn't enough content to be able to include in the curriculum. Is that what if I'm understanding that correctly? There isn't sufficient content to be able to include to teach the kids in the lessons. Am I understanding the question correctly?
She says that they work the materials that they have surrounding according the diversity of the country.
Right. Okay. Oh yeah. Well, listen, if they are given content, a curriculum with content that supports the curriculum by the government, and she wants to make it more diverse, or she wants to introduce variety, that is perfectly plausible. In other words, it's always ultimately up to the decision of the teacher to decide if the materials that you are working with are appropriate, if they meet the needs of the students, to meet the expectations of the students, and if they will help the students meet the learning goals and objectives. If for any reason, when you are evaluating, this is why lesson planning is so important, when we look at the material that we're going to present the following day, we have to look at it and say, will this work, or will this not work, or will this work only partially? In any of the three cases, if it's something that it will work, you work with it and you make the best of it. If it's something that will only, in your opinion, will work partially well, will not be as successful, then you as a teacher, and this is something that is universal throughout the entire world, teachers are or should be encouraged to apply their own creativity to be able to enhance the content, to make it work, to make it engaging, to make it meaningful, and to help the students be successful. So when you look at the content, you say, well, you know what, this is probably not going to work, okay? For example, let me give you an example. I went to observe a class some time ago. This was before the pandemic, and the teacher was introducing, I believe it was present perfect, using dates. And in order to, with the more open communicative activity, they were talking about a group from the year 2002, or was it one of these actors, an actor that people didn't really know. So the teacher had to look at that. Now, the activity was well designed in the sense that the students had to create a timeline, and the students would be able to do it if they knew who the actor was. But when the teacher asked the students if they knew who the actor was, most of them said they didn't. But that's when the teacher should have replaced the actor in the book for somebody they did recognize, because all of these were kids, these were teenagers, and the actor was somebody that would be somebody a little older would know. So the teacher unfortunately did not make the decision to change the content, and so that the lesson did not go very well at all. So it is up to us to analyze the content, see if it's going to work. Now, if the activity is not designed well at all, and I'll give you another example. There was an activity many years ago that I went to observe, and it had to do with, I'm not going to say the name of the book. I don't want to get into trouble because the person who wrote the book also was, well, anyway. So anyway, there was an activity about where the students had to answer a questionnaire, and it was very, very demanding. It was a questionnaire about life. And so one of the questions, and I kid you not, the teacher had to ask the student the first question. The first question was, what is the meaning of life? And let me tell you something. Most native speakers would not be able to answer that question. I would need a day, maybe, right, to think about that question and then get back to the teacher, right? As a native speaker, I'd need a whole day. I mean, that's a very deep philosophical question. So obviously, if you're looking at this activity, you're going to say, hey, this is not going to work. Because when the teacher tried to use it in class, everybody was quiet, everybody was silent, 0 student talking time. And the teacher got nervous. And of course, as you can imagine, if you have a coordinator in the audience and your students are not talking, they're not responding, the poor guy was sweating and he was turning red, he was getting nervous because he did not make the decision to omit that activity and replace it with another one or go on to the next one, which was a very good one. It was a group work activity involving the creation of a business, which is a different topic. He didn't do that. So my final point would be, if you look at the content, they're going to give you content. Everybody gives you content. If you work in a language center, if you work in a school, if you work in a university, if you work wherever, right? And in all the countries, it's generally the same. It's the same in Europe, okay? It's the same in Europe, the same in Asia. They all give you stuff to work with. You have to look at it. And ultimately, this is the great thing about teachers. Teachers are trusted enough, or should be trusted enough, to make the right decisions. The success of our lessons depends on the decisions that we make, and those decisions have to be informed decisions. If we make the right decisions, the classes will succeed and the students will look forward to seeing us again and to continue their learning process. If we make the wrong decisions, if we use content that they don't like, they can't relate to, and they're not interested in, then it's going to be very difficult for us to do our job and our work.
Yes, teacher. This question is from Viviana Manzanedo. How to give our students in a public school a lot of input if hours that we have aren't enough?
Right, perfect, great question. This is tricky. That's why, okay, this is a tricky question because I don't want to step on any toes. This is curricular. All right, this is curricular. It's also administrative. This is also an answer that has to do with how you administer a program. So for example, in the case of our programs at NYC, and this is what I also used to do at my previous institutions, I always created the resources and the means for students to continue learning on their own. In other words, I always tried to find a way to encourage the development of learner autonomy. Now, what do I mean by that? I wanted students to love English so much. For example, if we did our job in the classroom, and this is essential, if we do our job in the classroom, students will be happy, okay? And they're going to want to continue learning English. And if they love it enough, they're going to want to continue searching and exploring English on their own at home. And so what we have to do is we have to provide students with content, with leads on how they can continue exploring English regarding the topics and the areas of their interest, right? So for example, at NYC, what do? We help students get ready for their communicative practice sessions by giving them videos and other content in advance of their sessions so they can see how the language is used. And so not only does the platform help them, right? Because the platform provides a lot of massive amounts of input, but also, and this is the problem, you see, you just gave me an example. This is the problem when you're trying to teach online the way you used to teach in the classroom. This is not your fault as a teacher, but this is something that even the language centers that have been around for 80 something years, that's what they're still doing. They're trying to copy and paste what they were doing in the physical classroom, and they're trying to do it online. And in some cases, they have 25, 30 students, and it's very difficult to do that. So you have to adapt to the learning environment. You can't do the way you used to do them in the classroom. So this is from a program level. This is not the teacher's concern. Now, in the case of the teacher, you're going to say to yourself, well, how do I help my students? I mean, the content, okay. So you look for content on the internet, YouTube videos, articles, what have you, and you provide them to your students. Now, it's a lot of extra work. I do it. I do it for the programs that we teach at NYC. I spend nights, I stay till 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm looking for content to help the people who study in our programs be able to access this content to prepare themselves and to continue exploring, right? And so, for example, if you're going to teach how to order food in a restaurant, well, in my case at NYC, we're going to give you a menu from Denny's, right? We're going to give you videos on how to order food in a restaurant. We're going to give you a training video on how waiters and waitresses should work with the general public, the kinds of questions that they're going to ask, and the kinds of the way to proceed with the orders. So I give the students a lot of content. The motivated student will take advantage of that content and will learn and complement everything they learn on their own, complement what you teach them. So when they come back to class with you, they come better prepared. But it's not easy. In other words, it's a lot of hard work to create the content, find the content that complements what you're teaching in class, content that they're going to be interested in, content that's going to help them with their learning, and at the same time, encourage them and motivate them enough and inspire them enough to continue learning on their own. Because when you have that right mix, wonderful classes, effective, successful lessons in class, motivated students who continue learning outside of class because they loved what they learned so much with you, it's the perfect combination. So that would be my ultimate answer. Try to help your students, guide them, lead them in the right direction by giving them links to videos, articles, etc., websites on how they can continue learning on their own. And that will hopefully, if they're motivated enough, if they love English enough, if they feel great when they're with you, and you show them the way, they will continue learning on their own. And everything they learn, they bring to class with you. And they'll be better. They'll do a lot better. Final example. When I was at my previous institution, we did something called the Cultural Bridge. The Cultural Bridge program was established with a US university. And so our students had to, every month, have an interaction with a US instructor at the university level. And so we helped prepare the students. And I remember we did the pilot because it was my program. I was teaching a basic six. Okay, so basic six is about 120 hours of instruction. My students were talking, and I remember this was a program that was supposed to promote culture exchange between Peru. So our students taught, they learned about the US and New York from these instructors, but the instructors learned about Peru from the students. And so my students were teaching the instructor about Miguel Grau, the gentleman of the seas, his career in the Navy, when he grew up in Buda, and all of this. This is stuff that you don't find in the textbook. The other student was talking about Juan Diego Flores and how Juan Diego Flores is considered to be the new Pavarotti, right? And you know, the tenor, world-class tenor, and he was using all this language, basic six. And so if you create the right environment, if you provide the students with the right leads, if you guide them so that they can continue exploring the language on their own, and you motivate them, you give them something motivating to do, they can do a lot on their own, and that will enrich the experience and all the work that you're doing with them.
Thank you, Mr. Mercado. So please stay with us for the last picture. And now
of course,
I invited to Kevin.
Excellent, good, excellent,
yeah,
great.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Mercado. What a wonderful webinar. Amazing.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you so much. You're welcome.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah. Hi, dear community. We are going to, Miss Mariela, can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah. We invite you, dear community, of course, Mr. Mercado, for our next webinars. We have Michael Navarro for this for next Friday with the topic how to increase student engagement in a digital teaching environment. Well, after this webinar, participants will be able to apply different techniques and activities in their virtual lessons. And also next Saturday, we have our dear teacher, Nefti. This is also an important member in our community with the topic touching hands to teaching touching hearts. Well, this webinar is an attempt to show teaching as a form of caring, which will provide students with the intrinsic motivation to learn English in a more natural and effective way. Also, we'll be able to learn how to reach our students' emotions in order to make them learn in a relaxing environment, as well as how to create emotional links, which will facilitate the teaching learning process. Something else I can tell about Miss Nefti. Well, her current positions are the ESL teacher, trainer, program developer, and academic manager of natural English faculty in Spain. And she's also an expert in the field of methodology for second language learning based on the natural approach. We wait for you for this webinar, Miss. And let's see, this is the exit ticket. So we are going to share with you the exit ticket. So remember that you have 40 minutes to finish the exit ticket. Okay, so I'm very sure that in this moment you are going to see the link for the exit ticket in your WhatsApp groups and also in Facebook. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.